My name is Frank Abagnale Jr., and my career as an international master of deception commenced on a rainy Tuesday morning when I was only 16 years old. My parents had recently filed for a highly volatile divorce, a domestic trauma that systematically destroyed our family financial standing and forced me to transfer into a poorly funded public high school. On my very first day, the students mistakenly assumed I was a newly arrived substitute French teacher due to my expensive woolen blazer and my remarkably calm adult demeanor. Instead of correcting their hilarious administrative error, I walked straight to the blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and began to lecture the entire classroom with absolute technical authority. I spent an entire week executing this brilliant academic fraud, even managing to discipline the class bully and organize a mandatory parent-teacher conference before the real administrative staff discovered my actual identity. As I sprinted out of the rear exit of the building while the school principal screamed in absolute disbelief, I realized that the world was entirely willing to believe any outrageous narrative. As long as you possessed a beautiful suit and an unshakable confidence, the transition from a high school prankster into a sophisticated corporate imposter materialized when I noticed the immense social deference granted to commercial airline pilots at the luxury hotels in Manhattan. I forged a professional pilot license using a toy model airplane decal and a laminating machine, then telephoned the headquarters of Pan American Airways, claiming to be an employee who had lost his uniform during a layover in Miami. Within 24 hours, I was walking through the international terminals in a pristine, tailored captain uniform, the security guards saluting my frame while the flight attendants offered smiles of absolute admiration. I successfully utilized the airline open employee check cashing system to defalcate over $2 million from corporate bank accounts across 26 different countries, traveling the world entirely for free while sitting in the cockpit jump seat of major aircraft. The system was so deeply blinded by the prestige of the uniform that nobody ever bothered to verify if a 19-year-old boy was actually qualified to command a commercial passenger vehicle. Flying at 30,000 feet, the intense financial damage caught the immediate attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically attracting an obsessive, humorless bank fraud agent named Carl Hanratty. Carl was a meticulous investigator who lived entirely on black coffee and stale sandwiches, his office a chaotic graveyard of forged checks and geographic maps tracking my global flight paths. During a routine hotel raid in Los Angeles, Carl managed to corner me inside a luxury penthouse suite, his service weapon drawn as he kicked open the bathroom door. Instead of panicking, I immediately corporate masked my identity by presenting a silver wallet badge, introducing myself as Barry Allen, a secret agent of the United States Secret Service who had just completed the apprehension of the suspect. Carl looked at my calm demeanor, swallowed the deception completely, and actually handed me his weapon to secure the hallway while I walked casually past his entire tactical team and into a waiting taxi. When he returned to the room and realized he had been thoroughly outsmarted by a teenager, his furious scream echoed through the hotel ventilation shafts like a wounded animal. Realizing the airline fraud was becoming hazardous, I shifted my corporate theater to Georgia, forging a Harvard Medical School diploma to secure a position as the overnight chief resident pediatrician at a major regional hospital. I possessed absolutely zero medical knowledge, a terrifying deficit that I managed to mask by utilizing a brilliant strategy of complete managerial delegation. Whenever an emergency occurred on the ward, I would look at the eager interns and calmly command them to immediately execute their primary life-saving protocols to evaluate their technical competence. The hospital administration praised my leadership style as an exceptional educational methodology, completely unaware that their chief medical officer was secretly reading basic nursing textbooks in the staff bathroom to learn the definition of an appendectomy. I spent 11 months living in a luxury apartment complex, dating beautiful staff members, and cashing massive hospital checks until Carl Hanratty's investigation team began to track the specific ink pattern of my forged medical credentials to the local pharmacy. Relocated to Louisiana for my next grand illusion, passing myself off as a brilliant corporate attorney who had graduated from the University of California, Berkeley. I actually forced myself to study the real legal material for 2 weeks, miraculously passing the official state bar examination through sheer intellectual stamina and secure memory retention. I was hired by the State Attorney General's office, spending my afternoons prosecuting minor white-collar criminals while arguing complex constitutional law in front of local judges who praised my rapid analytical mind. Carl Hanratty located my legal office after months of tracing my financial footprint, arriving with a federal warrant only to discover that I had already vanished through a rear window 5 minutes prior to his arrival. I left behind a pristine copy of the local legal code with a handwritten, sticky note thanking him for his relentless dedication to our game of global hide-and-seek. The final curtain fell on my international career in the small historic village of Montrichard in France, the location where my mother had been born before she immigrated to the United States. I was operating a highly sophisticated printing press inside an abandoned warehouse, manufacturing millions of dollars in perfect international checks while living like a wealthy European aristocrat. Carl Hanratty entered the facility alone without his tactical team, his voice echoing through the massive industrial space as he informed me that the perimeter was completely surrounded by the French police force. I tried to launch a final humorous defense, claiming to be an innocent logistics manager, but Carl looked into my tired eyes and softly stated that the game was officially over because he knew my real age and my real identity. As the steel handcuffs latched onto my wrists, I looked at his exhausted face and let out a genuine laugh, complimenting him on his absolute tenacity before we walked out into the cold. European reign together, my imprisonment in a federal penitentiary was remarkably brief because the Federal Bureau of Investigation quickly realized that my specific artistic talents were significantly more valuable inside their own offices than inside a concrete cell. Carl Hanratty personally negotiated a special executive release package, allowing me to serve the remainder of my legal sentence as a top-tier consultant for the bank fraud division. I spent the next 30 years working side by side with the very man who had spent his career hunting me, utilizing my knowledge to design the uncopyable check systems that modern global banking networks utilize today. We became the closest of friends, an unlikely partnership of an obsessive, straight-laced agent and a former teenage master thief who had systematically fooled the entire world. I left behind the life of illusion not because I was forced to stop, but because I finally found a reality where my intelligence was valued without the necessity of a fake uniform. The financial brilliance of my operational strategy reached its absolute peak during a brief stay in Boston, where I observed the daily routine of the local bank couriers. I purchased a second-hand security guard uniform from a theatrical supply store, placed a neatly printed cardboard sign over the night deposit slot of a major downtown financial institution, and stood outside with a clipboard. The sign informed the public that the automated deposit mechanism was temporarily out of order due to technical maintenance and directed all customers to hand their cash deposits directly to the security officer on duty. I stood in the freezing winter wind for 4 hours, greeting wealthy business owners with an institutional politeness while they happily handed me their canvas bags filled with unverified currency. I walked away with over $300,000 in cash before the real night shift security guard arrived for his duty, leaving the cardboard sign behind as a hilarious monument to the complete gullibility of the local merchant class. Growing wealth required a suitable transport system that would not arouse the suspicion of the State Highway Patrol, leading me to exploit the systemic loopholes of the luxury car rental industry. I targeted a premium dealership in Chicago, masquerading as the spoiled heir of a prominent European shipping magnate who needed a fleet of sports cars for an upcoming promotional marketing campaign. I utilized high-quality counterfeit corporate bonds to secure the keys to 5 pristine vehicles, driving a brand-new convertible off the lot while the dealership general manager opened an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate his fictitious corporate contract. I spent 3 months swapping vehicles every week, parking my temporary luxury fleet in the executive spaces of the city's most exclusive country clubs, while the local police department unknowingly protected my assets from vandalism. By the time the counterfeit bonds were processed by the Central Clearinghouse in New York, I had already sold 3 of the vehicles to unsuspecting private collectors and moved my operations to the West Coast. The relentless pursuit by Carl Hanratty forced me to create my most spectacular defensive diversion, a corporate illusion that turned an entire university campus into my personal security perimeter. I arrived in Los Angeles and leased a luxury production office under the fictional name of Paramount Global Independent Studios, announcing a major nationwide casting call for a glamorous feature film about the airline industry. I hired a team of professional makeup artists and casting directors, spending $40,000 of stolen funds to audition hundreds of young women who were desperate to secure a role as an international flight attendant. I selected 8 beautiful co-eds, providing them with authentic, tailored uniforms and a generous weekly stipend to accompany me on a highly publicized promotional tour across the major capitals of Europe. As we walked through the international airports with camera crews filming our every movement, Carl Hanratty and his tactical team were completely blocked by the massive crowds of adoring fans and entertainment journalists, allowing me to board a flight to Paris right under his nose while he was trapped behind a wall of security guards demanding my autograph. The global tour with my beautiful promotional crew created an absolute logistical nightmare for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as my financial footprint began to appear simultaneously in 12 different European banking jurisdictions. I would cash a counterfeit payroll check at the airport terminal in London, board a commercial flight to Amsterdam with my entourage, and cash another draft before the British authorities could even notify their international counterparts. Carl Hanratty was permanently stranded 3 steps behind my flight path, arriving at luxury hotels in Rome and Madrid, only to find empty champagne bottles and humorous thank you notes written on hotel stationery. The international media began to track the mysterious phantom pilot who was outsmarting the American government, transforming my criminal evasion into a legendary public comedy that embarrassed the federal administration to the highest level. Carl's supervisor threatened to remove him from the case permanently, an administrative pressure that only fueled the agent's obsessive desire to bring me down. The nomadic lifestyle eventually began to take a heavy emotional toll on my stability, forcing me to realize that a 19-year-old boy cannot live inside a corporate mask forever without losing his mind. I decided to establish a permanent residential sanctuary in a quiet historic town in Utah, buying a beautiful ranch under a fictional identity and attempting to live the life of a traditional country gentleman. I integrated myself into the local community, donating generous sums of stolen money to the town library and hosting elaborate Sunday barbecues for the local sheriff department. I spent my afternoons riding horses and reading literature, experiencing a fragile semblance of peace that I had not felt since the day my parents filed for their divorce. This domestic paradise was abruptly shattered when a local bank teller noticed that the specific routing numbers on my personal checks matched a federal fraud alert that Carl Hanratty had distributed to every financial institution in the western states. The federal tactical team descended upon my luxury apartment complex in Denver with absolute military precision, sealing every street corner and installing snipers on the adjacent rooftops to prevent another humorous evasion. I was sleeping peacefully when the sound of heavy boots echoing down the hallway alerted my survival instincts, forcing me to realize that Carl had finally managed to close the geographic trap. I scrambled onto the exterior window ledge, clinging to the brick facade of the building while the federal agents shattered my front door with a heavy battering ram. I slid down the industrial drainage pipe into the rear alleyway, dressed only in my silk pajamas and carrying a leather briefcase containing $50,000 in cash. I walked into a nearby luxury hotel, convinced the night clerk that I was a wealthy guest who had been locked out of his room during a romantic misadventure, and managed to secure a fresh suit and a limousine before Carl could even finish processing the evidence inside my abandoned penthouse. The complexity of my forgery operations required an industrial upgrade, leading me to purchase a massive commercial printing press from an offset equipment liquidator in France. I established a secret manufacturing facility in the remote countryside, spending 16 hours a day experimenting with chemical solvents, watermarks, and international paper stocks to create the most perfect counterfeit checks the world had ever seen. I managed to replicate the exact magnetic ink and coating utilized by the international banking system, a technical achievement that allowed my fraudulent drafts to pass through the automated clearing computers without triggering a single error report. I was no longer just a clever con artist passing bad checks. I was an independent central bank operating from an abandoned warehouse, capable of manufacturing millions of dollars with the simple turn of a mechanical wheel. Carl Hanratty recognized the sudden escalation in technical quality, realizing that his teenage target had evolved into the most dangerous white-collar criminal in American history. To maximize my financial extraction before the federal authorities could locate my printing facility, I established a short-lived training program for young local grifters whom I recruited from the bohemian cafes of Paris. I taught them the delicate art of corporate theater, instructing them on how to carry themselves with absolute confidence when presenting high-value drafts to conservative European bank managers. My small forgery academy flooded the continental market with over $4 million in counterfeit currency within a matter of weeks, creating an international monetary crisis that forced Interpol to cooperate directly with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I sat in my luxury office overlooking the River Seine, watching the global news reports detail the massive financial panic I had created while sipping expensive wine and laughing at the complete helplessness of the international law enforcement community. The romantic illusion of the international playboy completely evaporated the moment the French judicial system processed my arrest, transferring my frame into the notorious Perpignan prison structure. I was stripped of my tailored suits, my head was shaved by a brutal institutional barber, and I was thrown into a subterranean concrete cell that was completely devoid of light or human warmth. The floor was covered in freezing muddy water. The air was thick with the stench of disease, and the guards treated my international reputation with an absolute sadistic indifference. I spent 6 months in this living hell, losing 40 pounds while my skin turned a sickly translucent gray from the complete absence of sunlight. I realized that the brilliant empire of fraud I had constructed was ultimately a fragile house of cards, and that the price of my humorous game was the total destruction of my humanity. The American government successfully negotiated my official extradition package after a lengthy legal battle, desperate to return me to federal jurisdiction before the French authorities could permanently break my health. Carl Hanratty personally boarded the commercial airliner in Paris to escort me back to the United States, sitting in the row beside my weak coughing frame with a blanket and a cup of warm tea. As the aircraft commenced its final descent into New York International Airport, my survival instinct flared one last time when I realized that a federal prison sentence of 40 years was waiting for me upon landing. I requested permission to use the aircraft restroom, utilized a small metal tool I had hidden in my shoe to unscrew the technical maintenance panel beneath the sink, and dropped my body into the ventilation shaft of the cargo hold. As the plane taxied toward the terminal where dozens of federal agents were waiting, I dropped out of the moving landing gear assembly onto the concrete runway, vanishing into the dark perimeter of the airport before Carl could even open the locked restroom door. My final flight from justice lasted less than 48 hours, as my completely exhausted physical condition forced me to surrender to Carl Hanratty at a quiet diner near the Brooklyn docks. I was brought before a stern federal judge who read a massive list of corporate fraud charges that carried a total penalty of 40 years of hard labor in a maximum security facility. Carl Hanratty took the stand not to demand my permanent destruction, but to deliver an unexpected testimony regarding my extraordinary intellectual capacity and my complete lack of violent intent. He argued that the United States government would achieve a significantly greater societal benefit by utilizing my mind to protect the financial system rather than letting my talents rot inside a concrete tomb. The judge looked at my young weathered face, listened to Carl's sincere plea, and issued a landmark judicial sentence that allowed me to serve my time as an uncompensated technical asset for the Federal Fraud Division. The transition from a federal inmate into a government consultant required an intense psychological adjustment, as I was forced to sit inside a small cubicle analyzing the pathetic amateur forgery attempts of low-level criminals. I spent my mornings reviewing bank ledgers, identifying the technical flaws in modern security paper, and designed new corporate protocols that rendered my own historical methods completely obsolete. I realized that the bank fraud agents were completely blind to the emotional motivations of a con artist. allowing me to revolutionize their entire training methodology by teaching them how to read the body language of deception. Carl Hanratty became my official administrative supervisor, guiding me through the complex bureaucracy of the federal government with a patient paternal care that I had missing since my family collapsed. We developed an unshakable professional rhythm, solving major international, financial conspiracies within hours by combining his relentless, investigative methodology with my chaotic creative instinct. 30 years passed in a blur of corporate security lectures, international financial conferences, and the quiet satisfaction of a legitimate career that required no fake credentials to justify its existence. I became the world foremost authority on check fraud and identity theft, designing the secure document architectures that are utilized by billions of consumers across the global banking network every single day. Carl Hanratty stood beside me at my official retirement ceremony, his silver hair catching the light of the federal auditorium as he handed me a commemorative plaque honoring my decades of service to the nation. We walked out of the building together into the warm afternoon sun, two former adversarial legends who had transformed a global game of cat and mouse into a historic, lifelong friendship. I looked back at the massive federal monument, realizing that the greatest deception I had ever pulled off was convincing myself that I needed a fake uniform to be extraordinary, when the truth was that my own authentic mind was more than enough to change the world. Every legendary empire must originate from a singular, modest transaction, a technical truth that I discovered when I encountered my first blank checkbook inside my father's shop. I realized that the local merchants looked only at the printed corporate logo on the header, completely ignoring the lack of financial liquidity in my juvenile savings account. I walked into a small grocery store, purchased a pack of expensive fountain pens, and presented my first handwritten draft with a polite, brilliant smile that disarmed the elderly cashier completely. The transaction was processed without a single second of hesitation, a tiny administrative victory that immediately validated my theory regarding the absolute supremacy of human psychology over financial security. I returned to my small bedroom that afternoon with a profound cognitive awakening, realizing that money was not a physical reality but a collective social illusion that could be easily manipulated by anyone who possessed the courage to act like an aristocrat. The initial success convinced me that my ordinary public school clothing was a severe tactical liability that would eventually limit the scale of my financial operations. I targeted an elite tailoring establishment in downtown Manhattan, introducing myself as the personal administrative assistant of a prominent international diplomat who was arriving for a global economic conference. I selected 3 expensive wool suits, 5 silk ties, and a pair of handmade Italian leather shoes, explaining that the diplomatic mission would settle the balance via an official corporate bank wire on Friday morning. The head tailor was so deeply impressed by my sophisticated vocabulary and my calm, authoritative demeanor that he insisted on letting me walk out of the store with the garments immediately to ensure my employer's satisfaction. When Carl Hanratty reviewed the case months later, he noted that this specific wardrobe expansion transformed a petty teenage runaway into an invisible ghost capable of walking into the highest financial institutions without a single raised eyebrow. My financial appetite expanded rapidly once I acquired my new wardrobe, leading me to investigate the systemic vulnerabilities of the regional department store refund networks. I would walk into a luxury retail outlet, select an expensive leather briefcase from the display shelf, and carry it directly to the customer service counter without ever visiting a cash register. I would inform the clerk that my wealthy uncle had purchased the item as a birthday gift, but had unfortunately misplaced the original paper receipt due to his severe absent-mindedness. I would demand a cash refund with a subtle touch of aristocratic annoyance, implying that their corporate bureaucracy was wasting my valuable time while my limousine was waiting outside the building. The store managers routinely authorized the cash payouts to avoid offending a member of the upper class, unwittingly handing me thousands of dollars a week for merchandise that had never actually left their own retail inventory. The necessity of verifying corporate credentials forced me to construct a primitive yet highly effective telephonic intercept system inside my temporary apartment rentals. I would lease 3 separate telephone lines under different corporate aliases, routing the wires through a central switching board that I controlled with a series of manual toggle switches. When a suspicious bank manager attempted to telephone the corporate headquarters listed on my counterfeit checks, the call would ring directly on the desk in my bedroom, where I would immediately adopt a deep professional voice to confirm my own employment. I spent hours playing the roles of human resource directors, senior vice presidents, and legal counselors, answering my own verification calls with an absolute clinical efficiency that left the banking industry completely satisfied. This telephonic shield kept the federal authorities chasing phantom corporate entities for 6 months while I collected their cash and planned my next geographic relocation. I realized that a young man traveling alone with large amounts of cash would eventually attract the attention of the state tax authorities, leading me to create an academic cover identity at Columbia University. I forged a premium student identification card and a letter of absolute financial sponsorship from a non-existent charitable foundation in Switzerland, presenting myself as a brilliant foreign exchange scholar studying advanced macroeconomics. I rented a luxury penthouse apartment near the campus, hosting elaborate intellectual salons where I would debate monetary theory with real professors who openly marveled at my intuitive understanding of the banking system. I utilized the university secure mailing system to receive my counterfeit paper supplies from international vendors, exploiting the academic immunity of the campus to shelter my criminal enterprise from the local police department. The intense pressure of maintaining multiple corporate identities in New York forced me to take a brief luxury vacation, booking a first-class suite on a transatlantic ocean liner bound for London. I boarded the vessel under the alias of a wealthy corporate heir from Rhode Island, spending my evenings playing high-stakes poker with international industrialists who assumed my youth was a sign of modern entrepreneurial genius. I financed my entire gambling operation by cashing counterfeit travelers' checks at the ship purser desk, utilizing a specific ink compound that dissolved completely when exposed to the salt air to prevent any chemical analysis of my handwriting. By the time the vessel docked in Southampton, I had won $50,000 in real currency from the passengers, leaving behind a trail of worthless paper that the maritime authorities could not legally investigate due to international water jurisdictions. Carl, Hanratty obsession with my financial footprint, began to dictate every aspect of his personal life, transforming his small office at the federal building into a chaotic museum of my past crimes. He refused to return home to his family on the weekends, choosing instead to spend his nights drinking bitter black coffee while mapping the precise serial numbers of every check I had ever cashed. He discovered that my forgery methods possessed a distinct artistic rhythm, a specific preference for symmetry and clean margins that revealed my underlying psychological desire for perfection. Carl began to respect my intelligence, realizing that he was not hunting a vulgar street thug, but a sophisticated, creative mind that viewed the entire financial system as an abstract puzzle. This mutual intellectual respect became the invisible foundation of our relationship, a silent bond between 2 lonely men who were completely detached from the ordinary world. During a routine flight from Dallas to Miami while sitting in the cockpit jump seat under my Pan American captain persona, the senior flight crew began to ask me complex technical questions regarding our flight path. The actual captain looked back at me, asking for my professional opinion on the turbulent weather system that was currently forming over the Gulf of Mexico. I swallowed my sudden panic, adopted a calm, authoritative tone, and advised him to maintain our current altitude while relying entirely on his automated navigation instruments to guide us through the storm. The captain nodded in absolute agreement, praising my conservative operational philosophy, while I secretly prayed that the aircraft structural engineering would compensate for my complete lack of meteorological knowledge. We landed safely in Miami without a single incident, the flight crew shaking my hand with genuine professional respect while I wiped the cold sweat from my palms and vowed to study basics, aviation literature before my next flight. The local authorities in Texas nearly terminated my career during a routine traffic stop on an isolated highway outside Houston, a dangerous encounter that required an immediate display of psychological misdirection. I was driving a stolen luxury convertible when a state trooper activated his emergency sirens and directed me to pull over onto the dirt shoulder of the road. Instead of waiting for him to approach my vehicle with his weapon drawn, I immediately stepped out of the car, dressed in my full airline uniform, and began to walk toward his patrol vehicle with an expression of intense professional urgency. I informed him that my commercial passenger flight was scheduled to depart from the international airport in 20 minutes and that a critical navigation error by my ground crew had left me completely lost on the state highways. The trooper was so deeply intimidated by the presence of a commercial pilot that he forgot to check my vehicle registration, choosing instead to activate his emergency lights and escort me directly to the airport terminal. With a full police motorcade, the secret to my international longevity as a counterfeiter resided in my continuous pursuit of the perfect chemical ink formula, a technical challenge that required months of independent research inside private laboratories. I discovered that the major banking institutions utilized a specific magnetic fluid containing iron oxide to print the routing codes on the bottom of their corporate drafts, a security measure designed to trigger an automatic alarm inside the mechanical sorting machines. I purchased a small chemical supply company under a false corporate entity, experimenting with different combinations of industrial pigments and metallic dust until I managed to replicate the exact magnetic signature of the official government ink. This breakthrough allowed my counterfeit checks to pass through the banking computers without a single manual intervention, rendering my financial operations entirely invisible to the automated security networks of the Western Hemisphere. My operational security was compromised during a brief stay at a luxury resort in Miami when a hotel maid accidentally discovered my manufacturing equipment hidden inside a walk-in closet. She entered the room while I was attending a corporate luncheon, discovering dozens of blank international checkbooks, official airline logos, and a collection of different rubber stamps drying on the vanity table. Instead of fleeing the premises, I immediately returned to the room, discovered her standing over the evidence, and adopted the persona of a senior federal investigator who was operating a top-secret counterterrorism surveillance mission from the penthouse. I handed her a $100 bill from my briefcase, commanded her to maintain absolute silence to protect national security, and checked out of the hotel within 5 minutes before she could contact the local manager. The elite country clubs of Atlanta provided the perfect geographic camouflage for my financial operations, offering an environment where wealth was completely assumed and credentials were never questioned. I joined an exclusive golf resort under the identity of a young real estate developer from Boston, spending my mornings playing matches with local bank executives who were desperate to invest in my fictional commercial projects. I utilized these social connections to secure large lines of credit at their local financial institutions, cashing massive personal drafts based entirely on a simple handshake over an expensive lunch. The banking executives were so completely blinded by my social status and my country club affiliation that they failed to realize they were financing my luxury lifestyle using their own corporate capital. The psychological isolation of my criminal lifestyle reached an absolute peak on Christmas Eve when I realized that I had nobody in the world to talk to except the man who was hunting me. I walked into a lonely telephone booth in downtown Chicago, dialed the direct federal extension for Carl Hanratty's office, and waited for his familiar gruff voice to answer the line. When he answered, I simply wished him a Merry Christmas, laughing softly as he immediately attempted to trace the call using his technical monitoring equipment. Carl stopped the trace, sat back in his chair, and informed me with a note of genuine sadness that I was only calling him because I was completely alone in the world with no real friends to share my wealth. I hung up the phone without responding to his clinical analysis, the cold winter wind howling through the glass booth as I realized that the special agent was the only human being who truly understood the architecture of my soul. The Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a massive multi-agency raid on my luxury penthouse in Atlanta after months of tracing the chemical composition of my printing supplies. Carl Hanratty led the tactical team into the building, his weapon drawn as they breached the security doors only to discover an empty room filled with expensive clothing and a single tape recorder spinning on the desk. I had anticipated the raid by monitoring the federal radio frequencies, leaving behind a custom-recorded message that thanked Carl for his relentless dedication to our game of international hide-and-seek. The recording concluded with a cheerful holiday greeting and a specific hint regarding my next geographic destination, a playful taunt that drove the federal agents into an absolute frenzy of administrative frustration. During my 11-month tenure as the chief resident pediatrician at the Georgia Regional Hospital, I fell deeply in love with a beautiful young nurse named Brenda Strong. Brenda was an innocent, gentle woman who had been recently excommunicated from her conservative family due to a minor personal disagreement, a vulnerability that matched my own deep sense of domestic isolation. I abandoned my corporate mask when we were alone, sharing my real feelings and my deep desire to escape the continuous pressure of the criminal life while still maintaining the fiction of my medical career. I purchased a beautiful engagement ring using my stolen hospital salary, promising to marry her and build a traditional quiet life far away from the chaotic urban centers of the East Coast. This romantic dream was abruptly shattered when Carl Hanratty agents discovered my forged medical credentials during a routine audit of the hospital employment registry. To secure Brenda family permission for our upcoming marriage, I traveled to their historic estate in Louisiana to attend an elaborate formal dinner with her father, a prominent state attorney. I realized that my medical persona would not survive an intensive interrogation by a trained legal mind, so I immediately shifted my corporate theater by claiming to be a recent graduate of the Harvard Law School. I spent the evening debating constitutional law with her father, fabricating an entire academic history and naming prominent federal judges as my personal mentors to validate my legal standing. Her father was so thoroughly enchanted by my intellectual stamina and my conservative family values that he offered me a senior position at his private law firm on the spot, completely unaware that his future son-in-law was a 19-year-old federal fugitive. The romantic illusion came to an absolute tragic conclusion on the night of our engagement party when Carl, Hanratty, and a dozen federal agents surrounded the regional airport where Brenda and I were scheduled to board a private flight to Mexico. I observed the tactical vehicles from the window of the terminal building, realizing that Brenda had unwittingly compromised my location during a telephone call to her mother. I kissed her goodbye in the crowded terminal, handed her a leather suitcase containing $100,000 in cash, and commanded her to wait for me in Miami before vanishing into the crowd. I managed to bypass the security perimeter by dressing as an airline baggage handler, boarding a commercial aircraft on the tarmac and escaping to Europe while Carl stood in the rain holding my empty engagement ring box. The European phase of my criminal career commenced in the small historic village of Montrichard, where I established a highly sophisticated industrial printing operation inside an abandoned tile factory. I lived like a wealthy French aristocrat, purchasing an expensive villa and hiring a team of local craftsmen who assumed I was an eccentric American investor manufacturing high-premium stationery. I spent my nights operating a massive offset printing press, manufacturing millions of dollars in perfect international checks that I distributed across the banking capitals of Western Europe. The quality of my work was so exceptional that the French National Bank issued a countrywide security alert, realizing that a single master counterfeiter was systematically undermining the stability of their foreign currency reserves. Carl Hanratty spent 3 months traveling through the rural provinces of France, tracing the specific chemical ink patterns of my counterfeit drafts with the assistance of the local gendarmerie. He visited every industrial ink supplier in the nation, slowly narrowing the geographic parameters of his search until he located the specific tile factory in Montrichard. He did not notify his superiors or request a full military intervention, choosing instead to approach the facility alone because he wanted to conclude our international duel with an absolute personal finality. He walked into the dark, echoing warehouse where the massive printing press was operating, his voice calm and steady as he called out my real name for the first time in 4 years. The conditions inside the Perpignan prison structure were designed to break the psychological spirit of the most hardened international criminals, a brutal environment that nearly terminated my physical life. I was confined to a subterranean stone cell that measured only 6 feet by 4 feet, with no bed, no toilet, and absolutely zero access to the outside world. The guards refused to speak English, delivering a single ration of stale bread and muddy water once a day through a small iron slot in the heavy oak door. I spent my days shivering in the dark, my body covered in raw sores while my mind slowly fractured under the weight of the absolute sensory deprivation. I realized that the beautiful suits, the luxury penthouses, and the adoring crowds were entirely worthless illusions that had guided me straight into a living tomb. The formal extradition process required my physical transfer onto a commercial Boeing 707 aircraft operating from Paris to New York, an international flight that Carl Hanratty supervised with absolute vigilance. I sat in the rear cabin with my hands secured in heavy steel irons, my body weak from the prison disease but my survival instincts operating at an absolute peak of frantic intensity. As the aircraft began its final approach into the international airport while the cabin crew prepared for landing, I realized that my life would be completely over the moment the federal marshals secured my frame on the tarmac. I requested a final bathroom break, entered the small lavatory compartment, and utilized my intense knowledge of aircraft engineering to remove the structural floor bolts beneath the toilet assembly. I slipped my thin frame through the narrow maintenance shaft, dropping into the unpressurized baggage hold as the aircraft deployed its landing gear after my miraculous escape from the moving aircraft on the New York runway. I managed to crawl through the perimeter fencing and find shelter inside an abandoned subway tunnel in Brooklyn. I spent 3 days hiding in the dark, my body bruised from the landing but my mind focused entirely on securing the financial resources necessary to execute my final escape from the country. I broke into a small commercial printing shop during the midnight hours, utilizing their manual equipment to manufacture a single perfect corporate draft for $100,000 under a fictional import alias. I cashed the check at a busy downtown financial institution during the morning rush hour, utilizing my old captain uniform which I had hidden in a secure transit. Locker months prior to my arrest, the final confrontation of my criminal career transpired inside a quiet neon-lit diner near the Brooklyn docks where I was waiting for a local courier to deliver a forged Canadian passport. I was sitting at the counter eating a plate of eggs when the door opened and Carl Hanratty walked in alone, his overcoat soaked from the heavy morning rain as he took a seat on the stool beside me. He did not draw his service weapon or scream for tactical backup, choosing instead to order a cup of black coffee and look at my exhausted hollow eyes with a look of profound paternal compassion. "Frank, your mother has remarried and your father has tragically passed away after an accident at the train station," he said with a soft horizontal tone that completely destroyed my remaining desire to run. I dropped my fork onto the ceramic plate, the tears streaming down my face as the entire architecture of my illusions collapsed, leaving me completely naked and alone in the reality of my grief. The federal trial in Washington was a remarkably brief administrative affair, as I refused to launch a legal defense or challenge any of the corporate fraud indictments presented by the state prosecutors. I stood before the senior district judge with my hands clasped in front of my plain denim uniform, listening to the lengthy catalog of my international deceptions, which sounded like a spectacular work of fictional literature. The prosecution demanded a maximum sentence of 40 years in a penitentiary to deter other young citizens from attacking the banking network. But Carl Hanratty stepped forward to offer a revolutionary alternative. He presented a comprehensive report detailing how my specific understanding of check chemistry could be utilized to develop the next generation of secure financial documents for the federal government. Initial months as a technical consultant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation were characterized by an intense sense of professional confinement that felt significantly worse than my concrete cell in France. I was assigned to a small windowless cubicle in the basement of the federal building, surrounded by stacks of amateur counterfeit checks and dry administrative manuals that required hours of meticulous analysis. The regular agents treated me with an intense professional hostility, viewing my presence as an insult to their traditional investigative methods and openly predicting that I would eventually steal government funds and flee the country. Carl Hanratty was the only official who defended my position, regularly visiting my desk to offer words of encouragement and ensuring that my technical recommendations were delivered directly to the director of the Bureau. The first major breakthrough of my legitimate career materialized when I designed a revolutionary magnetic encoding matrix that prevented the digital duplication of commercial banking checks. I discovered that the modern photocopy machines utilized a specific laser spectrum that could be easily deceived by micro-printed patterns hidden within the borders of the security paper. I spent 3 weeks working inside the Bureau Technical Laboratory, developing a custom chemical coating that reacted instantly to the heat of a scanner, causing the word void to appear across the face of any duplicated document. This invention saved the American banking industry over $80 million within its first year of deployment, transforming my reputation from a liability into an absolute corporate treasure overnight. As the years progressed, Carl Hanratty and I developed an unshakable professional rhythm, becoming the most effective anti-fraud team in the history of federal law enforcement. We would travel across the nation to investigate complex multi-state banking conspiracies, combining his rigorous systematic evidence collection with my intuitive understanding of the con artist psyche. I could look at a single forged signature or a counterfeit corporate invoice and immediately describe the age, the motivation, and the specific psychological flaws of the criminal responsible for the operation. Carl would smile, shake his head in absolute admiration, and command his tactical units to execute the arrests based entirely on my cognitive analysis of the crime scene. After serving the required length of my legal consultation contract with the federal government, I established an independent private security firm specializing in document protection and identity theft prevention. I transitioned from a low-paid bureau asset into a highly compensated international corporate consultant, advising Fortune 500 companies and global banking networks on how to secure their financial assets from the next generation of digital predators. I traveled the world once again, but this time I stayed in the penthouse suites as an honored guest of the board of directors, my legitimate credentials celebrated by the very institutions I had once systematically defrauded during my youth. The wealth generated by my legitimate security enterprise allowed me to purchase a beautiful permanent estate in the countryside, an environment that felt entirely like an authentic sanctuary after decades of nomadic survival. I built a modern research laboratory on the property, spending my afternoons mentoring young security engineers and designing the cryptographic systems that protect modern digital transactions. Miriam Clark, the retired principal who had once seen past my sister Vanity in my previous life narrative, visited our home frequently, her wise eyes reflecting a deep satisfaction as she observed my transformation into a pillar of the community. There were no false names on the mailbox, no forged passports hidden in the closet, and no sudden panic when an unknown vehicle approached the security gate. The private sector presented an entirely new architecture of institutional vulnerability when a major investment banking firm on Wall Street requested my urgent technical intervention to resolve an internal embezzlement crisis. I arrived at their corporate headquarters dressed in an immaculate charcoal gray suit, my legitimate security credentials displayed openly as I was guided into the executive boardroom by a team of anxious attorneys. A rogue financial officer had managed to bypass their digital auditing software by manufacturing a series of highly sophisticated ghost accounts that mimicked the transactional patterns of real corporate clients. I spent 6 hours reviewing their electronic transfer ledgers, identifying the precise mathematical anomalies that the perpetrator had utilized to conceal the extraction of $12 million from their offshore reserves. The chairman of the board looked at my final analytical report with an expression of absolute disbelief, realizing that a problem their elite software engineers had spent months analyzing had been resolved by a former teenage con artist using a simple fountain pen and a pad of yellow paper. My reputation as an undeceivable security consultant attracted the immediate attention of a conservative private banking cartel in Zurich, Switzerland, a financial institution that had operated in absolute secrecy for over 3 centuries. They flew me to their historic Alpine headquarters in a private corporate jet, desperate to upgrade their physical security systems before an international regulatory audit commenced. I walked through their deep subterranean vaults, observing their complex lock mechanisms and their manual ledger verification systems with a touch of professional nostalgia. I informed the board of directors that their ancient traditions were a massive security liability in the modern era of automated photography, demonstrating how an intelligent thief could replicate their master keys using a simple wax impression hidden inside a pocket watch. I spent 2 weeks designing a modern biometric access protocol that integrated their historic vaults with the latest cryptographic security systems, securing a permanent consulting contract that established my financial independence for life. The professional dynamic between Carl, Hanratty, and myself experienced a major structural shift when the federal administration announced his mandatory retirement from the Bureau after 40 years of unblemished service. He sat across from me at our favorite diner booth, his hands trembling slightly as he turned his gold retirement watch over and over in his weathered fingers. The absence of the daily investigative routine left him completely disoriented, as his entire identity had been built around the relentless pursuit of white-collar criminals and the systematic protection of the banking network. I realized that my friend was facing a dangerous psychological void, a profound sense of isolation that closely mirrored the emotional crisis I had experienced after my arrest in France. I reached across the table, grabbed his folder of unresolved cold cases, and proposed that he join my private security firm as the Senior Director of International Operations, a professional alliance that brought a sudden brilliant smile to his tired face. Our first private joint venture took Carl and me to the high-tech financial districts of Tokyo, where a major Japanese credit card corporation was experiencing a catastrophic wave of point-of-sale identity theft. The local law enforcement authorities were completely baffled by the operational strategy of the thieves, who were utilizing a primitive analog scanning device to duplicate the magnetic strips of cards inside luxury boutiques. I spent 3 days posing as a wealthy American tourist inside the major shopping avenues, observing the behavior of the retail clerks while Carl tracked the electronic signal transmissions from a hidden surveillance vehicle down the street. We managed to locate the central routing hub of the criminal organization within 72 hours, capturing a highly sophisticated international ring of counterfeiters before they could execute a massive holiday weekend liquidation strategy. The corporate executives honored our success with a traditional formal banquet, presenting Carl with an ancient samurai sword that he proudly displayed in his new executive office in Washington. The evolution of modern technology did not completely eliminate the traditional methods of physical forgery, a reality that became apparent when an international art auction house in London requested our assistance to verify a collection of historical checks supposedly signed by Winston Churchill. A wealthy private collector had offered to purchase the historical artifacts for $2 million, but his internal legal team suspected that the ink utilized on the documents did not match the specific chemical formulas available during the Second World War. I utilized a high-powered ultraviolet microscope to analyze the molecular structure of the signatures, discovering that the perpetrator had utilized a modern ballpoint ink that had been artificially aged using a heat lamp and a localized solution of chemical acid. I traced the origin of the forged documents to a small restoration shop in Paris, providing the local authorities with the exact evidence necessary to dismantle a massive historical fraud network that had deceived collectors for over a decade. During a rainy afternoon in Washington, Carl and I returned to the basement of the old federal building to retrieve a collection of archival evidence files that were scheduled for permanent digital preservation. We walked through the narrow dust-covered aisles, discovering the original storage boxes containing the counterfeit checks, the forged pilot licenses, and the fake medical diplomas from my teenage career. I picked up the original silver wallet badge I had presented to Carl inside the luxury hotel in Los Angeles when I masqueraded as Secret Agent Barry Allen, a hilarious encounter that had delayed his investigation by an entire year. Carl looked at the fake badge, let out a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the concrete basement, and admitted that my youthful arrogance had ultimately transformed him into the most thorough investigator in the history of the Bureau. We carried the boxes out into the modern sunlight, realizing that our chaotic history had become a priceless educational legacy for the next generation of federal special agents. The rise of international narcotics cartels introduced a highly dangerous element into our security operations when a South American financial network began manufacturing flawless counterfeit $100 bills using government-grade printing plates. The Federal Bureau of Investigation requested our private firm assistance to analyze the structural composition of the currency, as the bills were successfully passing through the automated detection machines. At the major international casinos in Las Vegas, I discovered that the cartel had managed to purchase an identical batch of linen paper from a bankrupt textile mill in Europe, a perfect physical match that rendered traditional texture verification entirely useless. I developed a specific chemical scanning solution that targeted the microscopic imperfections in the printing ink, providing the federal authorities with a handheld testing device that allowed them to seize over $50 million in fraudulent currency at the border crossings within a single month. The dean of the Harvard Business School invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual symposium on corporate ethics and financial security, an academic honor that filled my mind with a profound sense of historical irony. I stood before a packed auditorium of elite graduate students, all dressed in expensive suits and carrying pristine leather briefcases that reminded me of my teenage personas. I opened my lecture by projecting a massive image of my old federal mugshot on the screen, detailing how a 16-year-old runaway with absolutely zero academic credentials had systematically manipulated the entire global banking architecture through sheer confidence and an understanding of human vanity. I warned the future corporate leaders that the greatest threat to their enterprises was not a highly sophisticated technological virus, but their own willingness to defer to authority figures who wore beautiful uniforms and spoke with an unshakable social prestige. The students responded with a standing ovation that lasted for 10 minutes, a public validation that confirmed my past was no longer a shameful secret, but a powerful instrument of educational enlightenment. The core philosophy of our private security firm was centered around the concept of cognitive rehabilitation, a belief that young, nonviolent offenders with exceptional intellectual talents should be redirected into legitimate public service rather than destroyed by the prison system. I established a charitable foundation that partnered with federal judges to identify young computer hackers and amateur forgers who displayed signs of genius during their initial criminal investigations. We provided them with full academic scholarships, professional mentorship, and a secure pathway into the cybersecurity industry, transforming potential corporate threats into dedicated protectors of the digital realm. Carl Hanratty supervised the educational program with a strict paternal discipline, ensuring that the students maintained absolute ethical compliance while I taught them how to utilize their creative instincts to outsmart the real criminal syndicates operating across the dark web. The ultimate validation of my life work arrived on a quiet morning in late autumn when the governor of the Federal Reserve System telephoned my private office to request my personal signature on a new national monetary security directive. I sat at my massive oak desk, surrounded by the legitimate historical artifacts of a long, successful career, while Carl Hanratty stood near the window watching the fallen leaves dance across the manicured lawn of our estate. I dipped my expensive fountain pen into the black inkwell, signing my real name onto the official government document that established the secure design standards for all future United States currency. I looked at the signature, realizing that the long, frantic chase that had commenced in a small public high school 30 years ago had officially concluded with the absolute triumph of truth. I had spent my youth running from the law, using 1,000 different names, but I had spent my maturity earning the only title that ever truly mattered, the name that my father had given me before the world fell apart. The nostalgic resonance of my past life returned, unexpectedly, during an international security conference in London when I encountered a retired Pan American flight captain sitting in the lounge of the luxury hotel. He was staring at a vintage aviation magazine, his wrinkled face reflecting a deep sadness as he recalled the historic era when commercial pilots were treated like royalty by the global traveling public. I took a seat beside him, ordered a pair of drinks, and calmly introduced myself as a security consultant who had spent years analyzing the operational history of his former airline. We spent 3 hours discussing the specific flight mechanics of the old Boeing aircraft. And as we parted, he looked at my face with a sudden flicker of cognitive recognition, asking if we had ever shared a turbulent flight path over the Gulf of Mexico in the late 60s. I smiled, shook his hand with absolute professional respect, and informed him that my memory was not what it used to be, leaving him with a faint mysterious smile that acknowledged the beautiful permanence of our shared corporate myth. AE, premium watch manufacturer in Geneva, requested our urgent presence to investigate a highly complex warranty fraud scheme that was costing their international retail network over $5 million a quarter. The perpetrators were utilizing an advanced laser printing system to replicate the specific cryptographic serial numbers etched into the sapphire crystal faces of the luxury timepieces, allowing them to return counterfeit replicas to official dealerships for full cash refunds. Carl and I spent a week analyzing the microscopic patterns of the fraudulent etchings, discovering that the thieves were utilizing a specific industrial laser available only within the medical research facilities of Eastern Europe. We coordinated a multi-agency international sting operation, capturing the mastermind behind the scheme inside a luxury boutique in Paris while he was attempting to return a counterfeit platinum chronograph. The manufacturer rewarded our firm with a pair of custom-designed timepieces that bore our initials, an ironic symbol of legitimacy for a man who had once spent his life trying to outrun the clock. The evolution of digital inkjet printing technology introduced a massive structural vulnerability into the regional banking networks of the Midwest, as a localized ring of university students began manufacturing high-quality payroll checks using commercial computer hardware. The local authorities were completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the fraudulent drafts, which were appearing at hundreds of independent grocery stores and check-cashing facilities every Friday afternoon. I traveled to Ohio to review the physical evidence, realizing that the students had managed to bypass the traditional security scanners by mixing ordinary commercial ink with a specific liquid copper compound that mimicked the magnetic properties of genuine checks. I designed a simple physical alteration for the standard retail scanning machines, a software update that analyzed the thickness of the paper stock rather than the magnetic signature of the ink, terminating the student's criminal operation within 48 hours of its deployment. The emotional resolution of my family trauma materialized when I utilized a portion of my legitimate corporate earnings to purchase the original historic ranch in Utah where my parents had spent their happiest summers before the divorce. I spent months restoring the property to its original architectural condition, replacing the broken fencing and filling the stables with the exact breed of horses my father had loved during his youth. I invited my mother to visit the estate for a quiet weekend dinner, an environment that felt entirely like an authentic sanctuary with its warm stone fireplaces and the comforting aroma of fresh pine needles. We sat on the expansive front porch watching the sunset over the mountains. And for the first time in 30 years, we spoke about the past without a single flicker of anger or regret, realizing that the broken pieces of our family history had finally been integrated into a beautiful landscape of peace. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Academy at Quantico, requested that I design a mandatory comprehensive training course on white-collar crime for all newly arrived special agent cadets. I developed a rigorous 12-week curriculum that forced the young officers to step inside the mind of an imposter, requiring them to execute mock corporate frauds and design perfect counterfeits to understand the technical limitations of their own investigative tools. I stood on the lecture platform with Carl Hanratty beside me, watching the elite cadets struggle to identify the subtle psychological vulnerabilities that allowed a con artist to dominate an entire institutional network. Carl would regularly interrupt the lectures to deliver his famous practical advice on patience and meticulous paperwork, creating a spectacular pedagogical balance that transformed the Academy into the most formidable anti-fraud training center in the world. The international shipping ports of Rotterdam presented a massive logistical security challenge when a European logistics cartel began, utilizing forged custom manifests to bypass the import tariffs on luxury consumer electronics. The loss of tax revenue was threatening the stability of the local maritime authorities, who could not manually inspect every single one of the 40,000 shipping containers that arrived at the docks every morning. Carl and I spent 2 weeks analyzing the digital structure of the automated custom manifests, discovering a hidden alphanumeric code that the smugglers were inserting into the electronic filings to direct their containers away from the inspection lanes. We reprogrammed the port central computer system to automatically isolate any manifest that contained the suspicious code, resulting in the immediate seizure of over $80 million in smuggled merchandise and the total destruction of the cartel operational capability. Continuous research into document security led to the development of the microprint revolution, a technical advancement that transformed the design of all modern commercial contracts and corporate bonds. I discovered that by printing rows of microscopic text that appeared as a single solid line to the naked eye, I could create an absolute barrier against high-resolution digital copiers which could not process characters smaller than a single micron. The text utilized in these security borders was actually a highly condensed copy of the United States Constitution, a patriotic design detail that became a standard feature across the entire global financial network. The major printing companies paid our firm substantial licensing fees to utilize the technology, a legitimate revenue stream that allowed us to expand our research facilities and hire additional security engineers from around the world. During a quiet winter month in Washington, Carl Hanratty utilized his access to the federal archival vaults to launch a personal crusade against a collection of unsolved bank fraud cases that dated back to the early 50s. We spent our evening sitting in our private conference room, surrounded by yellowed documents and faded photographs of forgotten master thieves who had successfully managed to evade the law during the pre-digital era. I utilized my historical knowledge of old printing techniques and regional banking traditions to trace the operational patterns of the suspects, identifying 3 individual men who were currently living under false identities in the retirement communities of Florida. Carl conducted the field investigations with a youthful energy that amazed his former colleagues, bringing the ancient fugitives to justice not to punish their aging frames but to complete the historical records of the Bureau he had loved his entire life. The International Criminal Police Organization hosted an elite global gala in Paris to honor my contributions to the development of international law enforcement cooperation, a glamorous event that transpired inside the grand ballroom of the Hôtel de l'Opéra. I stood in the center of the brilliant space, dressed in a custom tuxedo, while hundreds of senior police chiefs and federal directors from 30 different nations offered toasts to my legitimate achievements. I looked across the room and noticed Carl Hanratty standing near the grand staircase, his eyes reflecting a deep emotional satisfaction as he watched the young runaway he had chased through the cold European rain receive the highest honors of the international community. We stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the rain-soaked Parisian streets, laughing softly as we recalled the terrifying hotel raid in Los Angeles and realizing that our lives had become a spectacular symphony of absolute redemption. The digital age introduced a dangerous evolution in check fraud when a highly organized criminal syndicate in Seattle began, utilizing automated check-cashing kiosks to liquidate millions of dollars in fraudulent payroll drafts. The local banks were losing capital at an alarming rate because the automated machines could not verify the physical identity of the customers during the midnight hours. Carl and I traveled to the Pacific Northwest, establishing a temporary operational headquarters inside a federal surveillance van parked near the major financial districts. I analyzed the digital code of the kiosks, discovering that the syndicate had managed to exploit a fraction of a second delay in the remote database verification process to complete their transactions before the system could flag the checks as counterfeit. I designed a real-time software interruption protocol that froze the kiosk mechanics the exact microsecond a high-value payroll draft was inserted, allowing local law enforcement to apprehend 12 members of the syndicate during a single weekend sweep. The physical architecture of commercial security paper required a complete structural revolution. Once high-powered color laser printers became affordable to the general public. I spent 3 months collaborating with the lead materials scientists at a major paper manufacturing corporation, developing a custom dual-layer document stock that contained hidden chemical threads sensitive to localized heat. When a counterfeiter attempted to run our proprietary security paper through a modern laser printer, the intense heat of the internal fusor mechanism would automatically activate the chemical dye, transforming the entire surface of the document into a brilliant, indelible pink that rendered the forgery completely useless. This innovation effectively neutralized the threat of desktop counterfeiting for the entire retail banking sector, securing our firm reputation as the foremost innovators in physical document protection. Our investigation into an elite corporate identity theft ring led to a highly intense verbal confrontation inside a luxury skyscraper in downtown Chicago, an encounter that tested the limits of Carl Hanratty's tactical patience. A brilliant young computer engineer had managed to duplicate the personal financial profiles of the firm's top executive clients, utilizing their names to open millions of dollars in fraudulent credit lines across Europe. When we cornered him in his private office, he looked at my past criminal record and arrogantly stated that a former con artist had no legal right to lecture him on ethics or technology. Carl stepped forward, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying horizontal resonance as he informed the young man that his amateur brilliance was nothing more than a cheap countdown toward a 20-year prison sentence. The sheer psychological weight of Carl's authority completely broke the suspect's confidence, forcing him to surrender his encryption keys within minutes of our arrival. The continuous travel requirements of our international consulting firm forced me to seek a peaceful, operational sanctuary during our domestic transits, leading me to purchase a customized executive motor coach that served as a mobile research laboratory. Carl and I spent weeks traveling across the American interstate highway system, analyzing financial crime data from different states while our private driver navigated the quiet country roads. The interior of the vehicle was lined with advanced communication equipment, a massive library of criminal literature, and a premium espresso machine that kept Carl fueled during our long night sessions. We found a deep sense of peace in this nomadic professional existence, realizing that we were still traveling the country together just as we had during the frantic chase of our youth. But this time we were operating on the same side of the law with an absolute shared purpose. Our private foundation successfully established a formal recruitment alliance with the National Security Agency, creating a specialized educational pathway for young technological offenders who chose to reform their lives. We developed a rigorous screening process that evaluated not only the technical competence of the young hackers, but also their underlying psychological capacity for loyalty and ethical alignment. I stood before the first graduating class of the program at a secure government facility in Maryland, watching 20 young men and women receive their official federal security clearances after completing our intensive training curriculum. Carl Hanratty stood beside me with a look of immense pride, realizing that our unconventional approach to rehabilitation had created a formidable new defensive shield for the nation's digital infrastructure. The United States Congress invited me to present expert testimony before the Senate Committee on Banking and Financial Services to support a sweeping new legislative mandate on consumer identity protection. I sat at the witness table inside the historic Senate chamber, surrounded by rows of television cameras and prominent lawmakers who listened intently to my comprehensive analysis of systemic banking vulnerabilities. I explained that the true defense of the financial system required a mandatory transition toward biometric verification and encrypted document tracking, arguing that paper credentials were inherently obsolete in a globalized electronic economy. The committee utilized my testimony to draft the historic Financial Integrity Act, a landmark piece of legislation that permanently altered the security protocols of every commercial bank in the country, and cemented my legacy as a protector of the public interest. A major financial institution in Toronto requested our immediate international intervention when a highly sophisticated ring of check forgers began utilizing genuine government printing plates that had been stolen from a local transit authority. The counterfeiters were manufacturing perfect replicas of regional transit bonds, cashing them at small credit unions across the Canadian provinces, and escaping with millions of dollars in cash every week. I traveled to Canada with Carl, analyzing the microscopic ink distribution on the fraudulent bonds and discovering that the thieves were utilizing an obsolete industrial printing press located in an isolated rural community in Ontario. We coordinated a high-stakes tactical raid with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, capturing the entire operation and recovering the stolen government plates before they could be utilized to execute a massive international bond fraud strategy. During a cold, rainy evening in Washington, Carl Hanratty and I returned to our favorite historic diner booth to celebrate the 30th anniversary of my formal release from the federal penitentiary. We sat in the warm, comforting space, the soft, classical music playing in the background while the steam rose from our ceramic coffee mugs in a gentle domestic rhythm. Carl looked out the window at the passing city traffic, his old eyes reflecting a deep, serene satisfaction as he turned his gold retirement watch over and over in his weathered hands. "Frank, we have caught every major predator who ever dared to attack the system," he said with a soft, horizontal resonance that carried the immense weight of our shared life history. I smiled, raised my coffee mug to offer a silent toast to my oldest friend, realizing that the long, frantic chase that had defined our youth had permanently stabilized into an unshakable landscape of absolute peace. The final chapter of my active consulting career materialized when Carl and I decided to establish a permanent corporate research pavilion on a quiet, isolated island in the Pacific Northwest.